Hi, we meet again in our next audit sampling class. So today we are going to continue with the non-statistical sampling. Okay. Now, in previous class, we have talked about statistical sampling, and today we shall continue with the non-statistical sampling. So as a general rules, this is a sampling approach that does not have above characteristic, which is a statistical sampling, is considered as non-statistical sampling, and most auditors will use this approach because it is considered as less costly and also less time consuming. Advantage of non-statistical sampling, besides lower training costs, this is much easier, and proposed adjustment can be done on quantitative basis. Quantitative analysis. As for disadvantage, among others, is the training difficulties, absence of consistency, potential litigation problems. They may cause incorrect evaluation of sampling risks. In terms of similarities, again, in selecting the sample, each item in the population will have a chance of selection. And designing the sample, audit tests are performed to the desired sampling risk, and also to minimize the non-sampling errors. Another one is in terms of steps of the sampling. It's just the same thing, involve error analysis, so more or less there's not so much difference when it comes to meeting the audit objectives. In terms of differences between the two, statistical sampling and non-statistical sampling, under statistical, we need to have knowledge on statistical formulas, so we have to send our staff for training. But the non-statistical sampling mainly based on experience and common sense, audit judgment. In terms of objectives, statistical have objective results because samples are mathematically proven, put into the certain application, and then that can represent population. But for the non-statistical sampling, it's very much subjective, and for that reason the sample may not represent the population. Different auditor will, with the same approach, again with the same answer for the statistical, but it may be different for non-statistical because different auditor may have a different view or approach on the risk area, but usually there may not be that much difference. It is an efficient method if you use statistical sampling as compared to non-statistical, because if you use the non-statistical sampling, we very much depends on the senior audit staff to actually devise the sample, and they are also a much more experienced staff to design sample procedure. Statistical sampling main advantage would be defensible in the court of law because we use certain tools which is already proven to be reliable, as compared to non-statistical sampling where it's not defensible because most of the time the auditor will use their judgment. Okay, for the next slides, we are looking at the application of sampling on audit tests. Okay, regardless of whether we are using statistical or non-statistical sampling, the common steps of application audit tests are, as you can see on the slide. The first is we plan the sample or design the sample size. For example, more than 10,000 in terms of amount or invoice number from number 15,500 to 2,000. And then we're going to select the sample. Maybe our basis of selections is every 5 document. Then we test the sample by vouching. Then only we evaluate the result, the percentage of population, and the conclusion. Now let us go one by one, looking at the first one, planning the sample. When we want to design the audit sample, as auditor, we need to consider the objectives of the audit procedure and the attributes of the population from which the sample will be drawn. This is important and to make sure that those conditions are relevant to the objectives of the audit procedures and included in the projection of errors. Population here means the entire set of data from which a sample is selected and about which the auditor wishes to draw the conclusions. So these are the steps. We determine the objective, we define what errors and deviation are being sought. That means that we can tolerate. We identify the population sampling unit. We stratify, that means divide it into small groups. Then only we decide on the sample size. Okay, this is just explanation to what I have mentioned earlier. We determine the objective and we define the areas of the deviation. Identify the population. This is when we may stratify the sampling. Basically, the audit objective is to focus on greater audit work on areas that are high interest risk. High interest risk here has the potential to have material misstatement. Okay, monetary value is the most common method of stratifying a population, particularly assets balances. So under item 4 here, it shows that how we stratify the population. We can see that the process of dividing population into subpopulations. For example, if you have 40 items of receivable, which consists of item more than 10,000 items, here mean the account receivable balances between 5 to 10,000 and then less 5,000. So we might want to choose randomly 3 items from account balances with more than 10,000 balances. With balances 5 to 10,000, we want to choose 10 items, and less than 5,000, we might want to choose 27 items, make up a total of 40 items. Now, as part of planning, the sample is deciding on the sample size. We try as much as we can to reduce the sample risk to an acceptably low level. Of course, the larger the sample selected, the more representative of the population. But again, it is not a good idea to actually choose all the samples that we have. So we need to have cost versus benefit in doing so. So in order to save time and cost, that's why we say we need to stratify the population. So let's say we decide that out of 40 item we have earlier, we want to take only 15. So we may choose all 3 items more than 10,000, 6 from 5,000 to 10,000 balances, and 6 from the item below 5K. So because when we take 15 samples, this can actually represent the whole population. So we don't have to actually take the whole population to perform or to satisfy our audit objectives. Okay, again, there are 2 types of tests that we need to do. As we mentioned in the earlier class, there are tests of control and substantive tests of procedures. Different factors will actually influence us in choosing the sample size. For test of control, it very much depends on our intended reliance on internal control, as well as our tolerable rate of error and our expected rate of error, as well as our required confidence level. So this would slightly differ between auditors. But for substantive procedures, factors that will influence sample size would be assessment of the inherent and control risks and use of other substantive procedures, for example, confirmation. Okay, at this stage, you don't have to worry about what would be the audit procedures that we're going to perform, because that will be covered in another topic, subtopics. Again, it's the same thing, tolerable error and expected rate of error in the population. Selecting the sample, again, we mentioned this earlier, statistical or non-statistical. I'm not going to elaborate on this. But at the very last line, it says that the principal methods of selecting samples are the use random number tables or CATS, systematic selection and haphazard selections. CATS or computerized assisted audit techniques is just one method of statistical sampling using certain application where we can purchase from the vendor. So this is discussion on the random sampling. Perhaps this is considered as the best method, where each item in the population has the equal chance of selections, where we have computed number tables to generate random numbers. The main advantage would be to disallow auditor to be biased and affect the selection of sample. So each sample have the chance of being selected. And then we have systematic selection. For example, we have 1,000 items. Maybe we will choose every 20th items, depending on how many samples we intend to select. We also have haphazard sample, but this is the, I would say, the most inappropriate method, because this is only practical when the population is not ordered in any numerical sequence order, but in considering that companies are geared towards computerized information systems, so it's much easier to use the previous two samples compared to haphazard sample. Okay, moving on to the next slide. Testing the sample, perform the audit procedures. Again, the choice of audit procedures must be appropriate to the particular audit objectives. So don't worry about this, we will discuss this in the next slide. Okay, but bear in mind, samples that we have selected may not be appropriate due to void. Okay, what we mean here is that if selected item is not appropriate, not because of error, but maybe because of a transaction void, audit procedure should be performed on a replacement item. For example here, I give an example here. Let's say you have a void check that you have selected, so you might have ignored this sample and we are going to take another sample. But that not to say that the void check will not be part of the sample that you have chosen. Okay, again, sometimes the auditor are unable to apply the design audit procedures because the documentation relating to that item has been lost. So you have to think of another way by replacing it with another document, but you also have to report the missing invoice in the management letter. That means this is part of the weakness in the internal control system of the client company. Comes to evaluating the results, each error that you have discovered will need to be examined for its implication. An error with that consistent with expectation during the planning stage can be projected to have an impact on the population. So that's why we need to analyze nature and the cause of error. Okay, so we need to consider the qualitative aspect of the error, because we do not want the error to have been performed because of fraud element. We also do need to project the error, okay, out of the example for test of control as well as example for substantive test. If it is higher than the tolerable error, that we might have to conclude that the account balance is materially misstated for substantive tests, and for the test of control, we might say that control procedures is not operating effectively. And lastly, in drawing our final conclusion, auditors should evaluate the sample results to determine whether assessment of population is confirmed or needs to be revised. So we have to request the management to investigate any identified error, or maybe we have to modify the way we perform our audit, because we have to consider the effect on the audit report. Okay, that's all for today.